Hi everyone. In this lesson, I want to present you the encephalon in transverse sections. We will compare MRI with fixed brains and histology. But first, I want to comment some very interesting things. The somatotopic arrangement of the cranial nerve nuclei. As you see in this drawing, during the development, the newly formed neurons arrange in columns, the ones that are going to form nuclei and cranial nerve nuclei. We can divide the central nervous system in two halves through what is named sulcus limitans. An alar plate or dorsal one and a basal plate or ventral one. So these cells that are going to form the cranial nerve nuclei arranged in columns close to the central lumen. So the more dorsal one is for general somatic afferent. So the fibers that form the component of the general somatic afferent. They are located dorsally. And on the opposite, the more ventral ones are the somatic afferent. We have to point out that in here, the general somatic afferent and the special visceral afferent components have been considered together as somatic afferent because both innervate striated muscles. Remember that the general somatic afferent component is formed by the oculomotor, trochlear, abducent, cranial nerves because they innervate muscles not associated with branchial arches. They also include the accessory and hypoglossal nerves because they innervate muscles derived from somites. And the special visceral afferent component is formed by the trigeminus, facial, the nucleus ambiguous that is formed by the glossopharyngeus and vagus, and accessory because they innervate muscles that are associated with branchial arches. Okay? And the visceral components are arranged very close to the sulcus limitans, as the afferent visceral component is dorsal to the sulcus limitans, and the visceral afferent component is ventral to the sulcus limitans. Okay? This arrangement is going to be maintained and we will find it in the adult. However, some of the cells, some of them have moved to another location. Here I have represented for you sections at different levels of the brain stem. So here you have the mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, the more rostral portion and the more caudal portion of the medulla oblongata. Again, look, lateral to the periaqueductal gray matter, we have cells involved in proprioception. This is general somatic afferent component, proprioception of the trigeminal nerve. This is the mesencephalic the nucleus of the mesencephalic tract of the trigeminal nerve. Ventral to the sulcus limitans here, we have the more dorsally located, the visceral component that is motor for the oculomotor, and more ventrally, the somatic afferent component for the oculomotor. As we progress caudally, again, dorsal to the sulcus limitans, we have the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and ventral, the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Notice that these nuclei have slightly moved its original location, okay? But, however, they remain dorsal or ventral to the sulcus limitans. At the dorsal portion of the medulla oblongata, again, dorsal to the sulcus limitans, we found the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. And ventral and close to the sulcus limitans, we have the solitary tract and nucleus of the solitary tract, that is for the facial, glossopharyngeus, and vagus. This dorsal part of solitary tract and nucleus is involved with taste, so it will be an special visceral afferent component. Okay? Ventral to the sulcus limitans, again, we have the motors components. Dorsally located, the general visceral efferent component of the facial, and more ventrally, the motor nucleus of the abducent. Notice that the motor nucleus of the facial has moved to a ventrolateral location, okay, here. Again, we progress caudally and the same structure or an organization remains. So dorsally to the sulcus limitans, the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. More close to the sulcus limitans, the solitary tract and nucleus, okay, for facial, glossopharyngeus, and vagus. And ventral to the sulcus limitans, the parasympathetic motor nucleus for the glossopharyngeus and vagus, and more ventrally, the motor nucleus of the hypoglossus. Notice again that the motor nucleus for the glossopharyngeus and vagus, that is the nucleus ambiguus, again has moved to a ventrolateral location. And then again, the motor nucleus of the accessory, that is caudally located to the nucleus ambiguus, has the same location. And again, this sensory afferent for the nucleus and spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve remains in its location. Now we have to consider the somatotopic arrangement of the tracts. Look, here in this drawing is the central nervous system, okay? And I have marked here the tectum, okay? The tectum and the lumen, the central portion of the central nervous system, okay? Look, what is the tectum first? Tectum means the more dorsal portion, the cover, okay? So at the mesencephalic level, this is the tectum. The mesencephalon can be divided in a tectum or dorsally located structures here formed by the dorsal and caudal colliculi. And then we have the cerebral peduncles. There are two cerebral peduncles, 1 and 2, okay? They include inside the mesencephalic aqueduct and the periaqueductal gray matter, okay? So the portion of the cerebral peduncles that is located between the tectum and the substantia nigra is the tectum, okay? And ventrally we have this, the crus cerebri, okay? Formed by descending fibers, the cortico-pontine and cortico-spinal fibers. At the pons, the tegmentum forms the floor of the fourth ventricle and it reaches the ventral portion of the pons that is formed by pontine nuclei, transverse fibers, and longitudinal fibers. This area is the tectum, and it will include several structures as the spinothalamic tract, medial lemniscus, etc. And at the medulla oblongata, the tectum forms against the floor of the fourth ventricle and is located dorsal to the ventral portion that is formed by the pyramids and the olivary nucleus. So going back to this drawing, you will notice that the visceral tracts are located very close to the center, around the lumen of the central nervous system. Okay, they form the periaqueductal gray matter. They form the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus that is here at this location here. The motor nuclei for the eye, oculomotor, trochlear, and abducen, they locate ventral in a midline location, ventral to the lumen of the central nervous system. Okay, they should be located around here at the mesencephalon, and here we have the motor nucleus in the medulla oblongata, the motor nucleus of the abducen. The reticular area, the reticular formation that is in the tegmentum is a very large area and is involved in visceral, control of muscle tone and motor tone, control of reflexes, etc. Okay, there we should have the reticular formation. Vestibulospinal, tectospinal, all these tracts are again located quite close to the midplane and ventral to the lumen of the central nervous system. Okay, they form the tectospinal tract here, the medial longitudinal fasciculus here that will continue in the spinal cord as the ventral funiculus. And for sensory motor, lemnisci, spinothalamic tracts, corticospinal, rubrospinal, etc. Where are they located? Part in the tegmentum and part ventral to the tegmentum. For instance, here we have the spinothalamic tract. Here we have the medial lemniscus, the lateral lemniscus, okay? And in here, in the ventral portion of the pons, of the medulla oblongata and of the mesencephalon, we have corticospinal tracts. However, the rubrospinal tract is located in the tegmentum, okay? And also, nucleus ambiguus, yeah, the nucleus ambiguus that is caudal to the motor nucleus of the facial is located in the tegmentum, okay? So there is a somatotopic arrangement as well of tracts. Look, as the visceral being quite close to the center, okay? And also the vestibular and tectospinal, the more phylogenetically more ancient ones are quite close to the middle, okay? And as the more evolved or phylogenetically, they tend to locate away from the center of the central nervous system. In the spinal cord, it is the same. Look here. So for the sensory, okay, that is fibers that go up, they form the dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus. They are located where? They are located dorsolaterally, quite in the periphery, okay? Motor tracts are located more close to the gray matter in this case, okay? As in the lateral funiculus, as the corticospinal, rubrospinal, and also part in the ventral funiculus. Vestibular, okay? they were located quite close to the midplane, and they follow down in the spinal cord in the ventral funiculus. Reticula, they were located where? In the tegmentum and in a ventrolateral location. So now they remain in this position, in the white matter of the spinal cord. They remain in the lateral and ventral funiculus. And if we move now to the muscles, this organization, it also follows a structure. For instance, corticospinal tract, the first one. You know, this tract is involved in fine movements, okay? So where do we have more fine movements? In our face and in our hands. So this corticospinal tract is going to innervate muscles that are in the distant portions of the limbs, right here, in the forelimbs or hind limbs. You know, this tract is very well developed in primates and in our case, right? So, but in ungulates, doesn't reach as far as the spinal segment, the cervical spinal segments, okay? In dogs and cats, in dogs it reaches the cervicothoracic spinal segments that innervate the forelimbs, and in cats it follows to the lumbar segments, okay, for the hind limbs. The rubrospinal tract, this is very well developed in our domestic animals, in the animals, okay, and is involved in voluntary movements, but not in fine movements, okay. So this tract is going to innervate muscles that they are voluntary, for the voluntary movements, muscles of the limbs, but that they are in the proximal portion of the limbs. You know that we do not have as an accurate movement in our elbow than in our hands, okay? Then the tectospinal that reaches the mesencephalic tegmentum and goes down and is going to reach the cervical spinal segments. This is to turn the head around in following a sudden visual or auditory stimulus. So it's involved in movements of the head and neck. The reticulospinal tracts and vestibulospinal tracts, okay? These are very medially located, and also they are involved in to keep the muscle tone of axial muscles and also limb muscles. But they are very important in keeping the tone of the axial muscles. They are not involved in any voluntary movement. If we look at the nuclei of the spinal cord, you know, in previous lessons, I have said that the gray matter of the spinal cord can be divided in laminae, okay? Look at here, at the ventral horn. The motor neurons that form the 9th lamina, they innervate alpha and gamma, they are alpha and gamma motor neurons, and they are going to innervate axial and limb muscles. We have seen that in the spinal cord lesson. However, the motor neurons that are more medially located and they form the 8th lamina, they are for axial muscles, not limb muscles. Again, limb more laterally, axial more medially, okay? So now we are going to have a look at sections of the encephalon and comparing them on MRIs, fixed brains, and histology. We will progress from rostral to caudal. The first one, we see the olfactory bulbs here, and in a fixed brain is here, okay, the olfactory bulb, right, where the olfactory nerves enter the central nervous system. In the next one, we see here we have the olfactory peduncle, and we see the olfactory peduncle on an MRI, and the lateral rhinal sulcus. Okay, we see both cerebral hemispheres. They correspond to the prefrontal cortex of the cerebral hemispheres. And we see cortical and white matter, gray and white matter. For the next, again, we see the olfactory peduncle, and the lateral rhinal sulcus. Okay. We move to the next one. We are at the presphenoid bone. We see the presylvian sulcus right here, presylvian sulcus, and again the olfactory peduncle. Okay, olfactory peduncle. Look at something. In a fixed brain, we can identify white matter inside, surrounded by gray matter, but also here we see white matter outside the gray matter. And this is because it's a very phylogenetically ancient structure. It's like the spinal cord, white matter surrounding the gray matter, or in the hippocampus, white matter surrounding the gray matter. This is the basal portion of the paleocortex. Okay, and here we see white matter, but also here in the olfactory bulb we see here white matter. What is this? This is the intermedial olfactory stria, and on the periphery we have the lateral olfactory stria. We progress, and again we see the lateral rhinal sulcus, and again the intermediate olfactory stria here and here. And also in here we identify the lateral ventricles. In the next one, we see the white matter, and we begin to identify the corpus callosum. Okay, that is formed by commissural fibers that connect both cerebral hemispheres, and in particular, they connect neocortex. Okay, and we see the abasal nucleus, that is the coded nucleus, and the lateral ventricle. Okay, we are still identify here the intermediate olfactory stria here, intermediate. And in this Mulligan staining, we see the intermediate olfactory stria, and here the lateral olfactory stria. White matter on the outside. Okay, and we see something very interesting. We see a nucleus here, another one, and this one here. This is the accumbens. The accumbens is a nucleus that is located rostromedial to the coded nucleus. Okay. For the next, we see again the corpus callosum, the internal capsule, centrum semiovale, and the corona radiata right here. Okay, the coded nucleus, lateral ventricle here. Okay, and something that is located here that we can identify here is the intermediate olfactory stria and the lateral olfactory stria. On the MRI is difficult to see, but you know it is here. Okay, optic nerves. Okay, and this is Bialchowski. We see the corpus callosum, internal capsule, that is this internal capsule, centrum semiovale, and this is a fasciculus that is formed by associative fibers that connects the occipital pole with the frontal pole, subcallosal fasciculus, okay? And the caudate nucleus, We begin to identify some other basal nuclei. Here I present you a midplane section on MRI and compare with a mulligan staining. This dotted line marks the section, and we'll compare to this one and this to this one. Okay, first part of the dotted line is the cerebrum, okay? Here we get to the corpus callosum, Here we have the cingulate gyrus here. And underneath the corpus callosum, we have the telencephalic septum. What's the telencephalic septum? It's cortex, but it's a very ancient cortex. It's paleocortex, okay? It's the part of the cerebral hemispheres that have come together, okay, at the midplane. These ones here. This telencephalic septum has a cellular portion, that is this one here, and a pellucid portion here. Underneath, we have the rostral commissure here, or here, rostral commissure. Again, you see here, corpus callosum, telencephalic septum, and rostral commissure here. The rostral commissure is a commissure that connects both olfactory peduncles because fibers from the intermediate olfactory stria cross the midline. And also, they connect both piriform lobes here. And underneath, we have the optic chiasm. Here is the presphenoid bone. So again, in this mulligan, we have the corpus callosum. Underneath, we have the telencephalic septum, rostral commissure here, and optic chiasm. Here we identify the hypophysis. Okay. It is interesting to see these structures here, these white lines. They are the columns of the fornix. The fornix is formed by fibers, associative fibers, that come from the hippocampal formation. They run rostrally under the corpus callosum, and then they bend ventrally. They run caudal to the rostral commissure until they reach the hypothalamus, and in particular these ones, they reach the mammillary bodies. So here they are running caudal to the rostral commissure. Again, you see the telencephalic septum, rostral commissure, corpus callosum, right here, okay, caudate nucleus. Now, in this image, we see here this structure is the telencephalic septum. And again, these areas here and this one here are columns of the fornix. So this hypointense signal corresponds to the column of the fornix. And again, internal capsule, okay? And we are at the presphenoid bone here. So this structure, this white structure, as it is located caudal to the optic chiasm, corresponds to the beginning of the optic tract. Remember that the optic tract, it connects is the part of the optic pathways that runs from the optic chiasm up to the lateral geniculate nucleus. These sections correspond to this one. What do we see here? We see hypointense signal of the white matter, and we see white matter here. Okay, we are at the before the interthalamic adhesion at the level of the third ventricle. So we see at this here, we have the fornix and the fornix, the caudate nucleus, and the lateral ventricle. Okay, As in this section we are caudal to the optic chiasm, or just really caudal, we have the chiasmatic cistern. This is why we have hyperintense signal of the CSF. Okay. So for this one, we are at the level of the interthalamic adhesion. So we are at the level of the thalamus. Remember, there are two thalamus, right and left, okay? And underneath, so we have here, we have the third ventricle. Remember that this hyperintense signal, I have explained that in another lesson, does not correspond to the third ventricle. Okay, correspond to an extension of the subarachnoid space, right? And here we have underneath the fornix and the corpus callosum. Fornix and corpus callosum, okay? Underneath the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. So in this mulligan, we have the hypothalamus here, and in here we have cut of the hypophysis. So hypothalamic nuclei, and in particular here we have the mammillary bodies, and these white areas correspond to the columns of the fornix. This is the mammillothalamic tract. This section corresponds to this one. So we are cutting through the interthalamic adhesion. Underneath here we have third ventricle, a small third ventricle dorsally. This hypointense signal is the mammillary body, and underneath the hypophysis, okay? And white matter, of course, and a lot of nuclei that correspond to the thalamus. You can see the fornix and the corpus callosum. This is a bit more caudal. We are at the level of the dorsum cellae. What I want you to show here is this area here. We are at the level of the subthalamus. Remember that the subthalamus, I have explained that in another lesson, is a very important area in initiating the motor movements, okay? It has motor generator patterns. We see the lateral ventricles. Here we have the hippocampal formation, okay, here and also here. And on top, white matter, because it's a very ancient, is archicortex. Okay, we have white matter that forms the fornix. Okay, corpus callosum. Here we have corpus callosum and fornix. Okay. So, look, here we are at the level of the hypothalamus with the here the mammillary bodies. Look, one and the other, mammillary bodies. Here is the whole picture with thalamus, right? And here we have the subthalamus, right? With the subthalamic nuclei and the zona incerta. And here hypothalamic nuclei that are forming the mammillary bodies. As we are in the caudal portion of the third ventricle, we identify here the avenula and the fasciculus retroflexus here that connects the avenula with the intercrural nucleus of the mesencephalon. Again, we see this is an enlarged, this image is enlarged here. We see the hippocampal formation with the subiculum, hippocampus proper, and dentate gyrus. Okay. We see on top white matter. This is the alveus hippocampi, or the alveus, and this is going to form the fornix with the fimbrial fornix, and the apex is the taenial fornix, where all the choroidal plexuses are attached to. Here again, we see fornix. Okay, we go to this image, we see the part of the hippocampal formation, and fornix fornix here, underneath the corpus callosum. Okay? Something I want to show you here. Two things. One, first, what is this white structure here? It is this one here or this one here. This is the optic tract that is going to run from the optic chiasm up to the lateral geniculate nucleus. Okay? And it's located here. And another thing, what is that? This is the crus cerebri, okay, that are going up, and they are is formed by fibers that go down from the cerebrum, and they form part of the internal capsule. Okay. So at this level, we are at the level of the mesothalamus. So what is the mesothalamus? Mesothalamus is the part of the thalamus that is located dorsolaterally, caudally, dorsolaterocaudally. And we have the lateral cunate nucleus, this one here. It seems to be divided in two, but because there are white fibers here that are exit the lateral geniculate body to form the fibers that reach the occipital cortex. Okay, is the visual radiation. Okay, and here we have the medial geniculate body. This receives fibers from the caudal colliculus that are involved in audition, and the fibers that live from the acoustic radiation. Okay, this is the optic radiation, and this is the acoustic radiation. On an MRI, is located at this level here. Okay, or in a fixed encephalon, you have it here. The lateral geniculate body and the medial geniculate body. Okay? Again, it is very easy to identify the hippocampal formation here and here as well, here. And the white matter that leaves the hippocampus to form the fornix and the commissure of the fornix. So now you see this is a recess of the supraarachnoid space, and here we have the third ventricle that is going to become the mesencephalic aqueduct. Okay, you see the hippocampal formation, commissure of the fornix, and hippocampal formation. Important. Where's the lateral ventricle? Here, not here. Here there is a recess of the supraarachnoid space. A recess of the supraarachnoid space. Okay, here. The lateral ventricle is here and here. Okay. We are cutting the beginning of the mesencephalon now. Okay, and we are cutting tegmentum and crus cerebri, because this is the substantia nigra and this is the res nucleus. This is the crus cerebri. So the cerebral peduncle, it is located here. Okay. Here we should have the substantia nigra, the crus cerebri, okay, and the red nucleus. We still identify the mesothalamus, that with this is the lateral geniculate body, the medial geniculate body, okay? So we are here, this is the lateral geniculate body, the medial geniculate body, okay? And it's easy to identify here, this is this cortex. Now we have part of the fornix and cortex. This is the limbic cortex, okay? This limbic cortex that was described by Broca as limbus means border, margin, and is the cortex that is surrounding the mesothalamus. It is at the border of the mesothalamus. This is why it is called limbic cortex. Okay. What else? The corpus callosum, commissure of the fornix. Okay. Again, corpus callosum, fornix here, and there you have lateral ventricle, beginning of the mesencephalic aqueduct, and now you see that this is not a ventricle, is subarachnoid space, very important. Again, substantia nigra here, crus cerebri, red nucleus. Okay. Now we are at the level of the mesencephalon, and this is the shape of the mesencephalon. And in a fixed brain, the mesencephalon is formed by a tectum that contains the rostral colliculi and caudal colliculi. Rostral colliculi involved with visual reflexes, and caudal colliculi with auditory information, auditory reflexes, and the auditory information, because the caudal colliculi are going to be connected by the brachium of the caudal colliculi with the medial geniculate bodies. And as you know, the cerebral peduncles, to right and left, with the mesencephalic aqueduct, and in each cerebral peduncles, the tegmentum that is separated by the substantia nigra from the crus cerebri. Inside the tegmentum, what do we have? The mesencephalic aqueduct here, the periaqueductal gray matter, Lateral, we have the nucleus of the mesencephalic tract of the trigeminal nerve. And ventral, what do we have here? We have the motor nucleus of the oculomotor and trochlear cranial nerves. The medial longitudinal fasciculus, okay? The red nucleus, substantia nigra, and crus cerebri, okay? And the intercrural nucleus, okay? So, as you see here, the limbic cortex, the hippocampal formation that surrounds here, because here we see some of the, here we have the medial geniculate nucleus. This is the brachium of the caudal colliculus, and this cortex is surrounding the mesothalamus. Now we are caudal, and we are cutting mesencephalon and pons, okay? The mesencephalic aqueduct here, the periaqueductal gray matter. As you see here, the cortex that surrounds the mesothalamus. This is the lateral geniculate nucleus and the medial geniculate nucleus. The rostral colliculus and the brachium of the caudal colliculus that connects the medial geniculate body with the caudal colliculus. Look at this section and you will see this is the periaqueductal gray matter around the mesencephalic aqueduct, and then these points, these ones are these ones on white, is these ones here. This is the medial longitudinal fasciculus that connects vestibular nuclei with motor nuclei of the cranial nerves that move the extraocular muscles. And also down, they form part, or they are formed by vestibular tracts that they will continue in the spinal cord in the ventral funiculus. And lateral, we have the motor nuclei for here, these ones, the motor nuclei for the, in this case, for the trochlear cranial nerve, because it's caudal to the oculomotor cranial nerve. And ventrally, we have the pons, okay? This is the commissure of the rostral cerebellar peduncles, located here, and pons with the brachium pontis or middle cerebellar peduncle. For the next, we see the caudal colliculi, okay, here, the pons, okay, pons, and with the brachium pontis or middle cerebellar peduncles, and lateral, the trigeminal nerve, This is the ventral portion of the pons, okay, formed by longitudinal fibers, corticospinal, corticopontine fibers, transverse fibers that are going to form the middle cerebellar peduncles, and pontine nuclei. Now you can identify quite easily the caudal colliculi, the vermis of the cerebellum. And in the tegmentum, we found here, we have the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus or Schultz fasciculus. This is a fasciculus that comes from the hypothalamus, forms the ventral portion of the periaqueductal gray matter, and continues caudally and connects hypothalamic nuclei with visceral nuclei of cranial nerves, and continues in the cervical spinal segments, okay, in the dorsal gray commissure. What else you have here? This structure, this one here, is this one here. This is the rostral cerebellar peduncle before the decussation of the rostral cerebellar peduncles. Here you have the rubrospinal tract. Here you have the medial longitudinal fasciculus and tectospinal tract, reticular formation, okay, and medial lemniscus, a spinothalamic tract, and lateral lemniscus. Here, this is the ventral, this is the line that separates tegmentum and ventral portion. You have the lateral lemniscus, spinothalamic tract, medial lemniscus. And in the ventral portion, you have the longitudinal fibers, pontine nuclei, and transverse fibers that form, here, you see the transverse fibers that form the brachium pontis that are going to enter the cerebellum. Here you have the locus coeruleus, noradrenergic cells, okay? It is also the pontine micturition center. It continues up in the mesencephalon. Here you can see, it is interesting because you can see these elevations here. These correspond to the rostral cerebellar peduncle. Because the rostral cerebellar peduncle, this is a midplane section, here we have the level of mesencephalon, pons, medulla oblongata, and spinal cord, the mesencephalic aqueduct, fourth ventricle, and you see this is the rostral cerebellar peduncle that connects the cerebellum with the mesencephalon, and is the most medial cerebellar peduncle. So it is here. Lateral here, you have the lateral or lateral cerebellar peduncle or brachium pontis. Here, this one here, okay? And laterally located the trigeminal nerve. Here you have the pyramids, because in this section, it is, we see dorsally, we see the dorsal portion is more rostral than the ventral portion. We identify the caudal colliculi, okay? Now we are at the level of the more rostral portion of the medulla oblongata, at the level of the trapezoid body. You see the fourth ventricle here, the lingula of the cerebellum, the vermis, the cerebral hemispheres, okay? Here we have the flocculus, the ventral paraflocculus, the dorsal paraflocculus. the flocculus that forms with the nodulus, the flocculonodular lobe, the flocculus, the ventral paraflocculus that extends in a bony cavity, okay, extends inside here. The pyramids, okay, here, and the facial and vestibulocochlear nerves. Facial and vestibulocochlear nerves. This is the cochlea. Okay, in this section, it is interesting to identify here, we have the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, and we see these white fibers here. They correspond to the motor fibers of the facial nerve. They have gone around the motor nucleus of the abducent cranial nerve, and in order to live between this, the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and the rubrospinal tract, and they are going to live forming the facial nerve. Okay. For the next one, it's very similar. You can see here the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, spinal tract, the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve here. These are the dorsal, the dorsal nuclei of the trapezoid body here that are involved in audition, okay? The pyramids here, and these transverse fibers, they form the trapezoid body, okay? These white transverse fibers, they have the ventral nuclei of the trapezoid body. This is the dorsal nuclei of the trapezoid body, formerly known as rostral olivary nucleus, right? So here we are at the level of the caudal cerebellar peduncle, the lingula, the fourth lingula, fourth ventricle, okay, medial longitudinal fasciculus and tectospinal tract, and the internal genu of the facial nerve, and these are the facial fibers, as you see, and they are going to live between the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and the rubrospinal tract. Okay. We also have at this level vestibular nuclei. Okay, vestibular nuclei. We also have nuclei of the deep cerebellar nuclei, fastigius, interpositus, dentatus. Slightly more caudal, okay, we still see the pyramids, okay, the spinothalamic tract and medial lemniscus. We don't see the lateral lemniscus anymore because it starts, the lateral lemniscus starts at the level of the dorsal nuclei of the trapezoid body and runs rostrally up to the caudal colliculus of the mesencephalon. So we don't see it anymore here. We see the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve here, the rubrospinal tract, the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, and we begin to identify the motor nucleus of the facial nerve. Okay, that, as I have said before, it has moved from its original position. This is the sulcus limigens at this level, has moved to a ventrolateral location. Okay, here we still have the motor nucleus of the abducent cranial nerve. We move caudally, and we see here we have the caudal cerebellar peduncle, or corpus restiforme and juxtarestiforme. We see the stria acoustica here going on top, this white area here. We identify the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. The spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve should be located here. Here we have the caudal cerebellar peduncle, okay? The pyramids, okay? And here is the caudal portion of the motor nucleus of the facial, and we begin to find the ambiguous, the rostral portion of the ambiguous. Okay. Medial longitudinal fasciculus and tectospinal tract, and again, sulcus limitans. Okay. You see the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle and the lateral openings of the fourth ventricle. Okay. You can see how many choroidal plexuses we have inside here. Again, we see the choroidal plexuses of the fourth ventricle. As you see, the medulla oblongata is beginning to have the shape of what it will be the spinal cord. Okay, this is the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve here. Here we have the caudal cerebellar peduncle here at this level, the pyramids, okay, here. And again, we begin to identify structures that will, at this level, okay, we will identify them better in next sections. The vermis, paramedian lobule, and the rest of the cerebellar hemisphere with the, as you see, all these cerebellar hemisphere. Okay. Now, again, inside the white matter of the cerebellum, this is a caudal section, and as we are looking caudally in this section, this is not the lingula anymore, it is the nodulus, caudal nodulus, okay? And inside the white matter, we have areas. This corresponds to the fastigious, interpositus, and dentatus, dentate nuclei. Okay. The fourth ventricle, right? And again, we are going to put the sulcus limitans here. Ventral to the sulcus limitans, going medially, what we will have? The motor nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve, the parasympathetic motor nucleus of the glossopharyngeus and vagus, okay? Nucleus ambiguous, okay, has moved from this original position, and here we have this white area. It corresponds to this one, okay, this area here, or this one. This is the solitary tract, visceral afferent, and the nucleus of the solitary tract, visceral afferent, okay, visceral afferent. Here we have the caudal cerebellar peduncle and olivary nucleus, pyramids, the olivary nucleus here, okay. Decussation of the lemnisci, okay, with the deep arcuate fibers and the fibers that these are the olivocerebellar fibers here, olivocerebellar fibers that go to the cerebellum. Pitmocaudal, vermis, paramedian lobule, okay. As you see, the fourth ventricle starts to diminish. We still see the pyramids, the olivary nucleus, and again the sulcus limitans. On dorsally, what are we going to have here? The spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, the solitary tract and nucleus, parasympathetic nucleus of the glossopharyngeus and vagus. Here we have the motor nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, and again, you see, and this is the same structures we can make the here with the sulcus limitans. Okay, all right. Now in this image is a bit more caudal. As you see, there is no more fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is become the central canal of the spinal cord. It will be the central canal of the spinal cord. okay? We are at the level of the obex, and what do we see? The pyramids here. So the pyramids, okay? We still have olivary nucleus here, and again, these fibers, these fibers here, they are hypoglossal fibers coming from the motor nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. These are hypoglossal fibers. They are going to leave the medulla oblongata ventrolaterally, okay, lateral to the pyramids. And again, what do we have? We have, again, if we make this sulcus limitans, we are going to have at this level the parasympathetic motor nucleus of the vagus. Here, dorsally, we have the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve with the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, should be located around here. The medial cunate nucleus and gracial nucleus with the cunate fascicle and gracial fascicle. They are located at this level here, okay, right? We progress caudally, okay, and now we don't see the pyramids anymore here because we are at the level of the decussation of the pyramids. Look at that. We are at the level, this is central canal, and these are the fibers that are going up and they cross the midline. They cross the midline here. These are the fibers. This is the decussation of the pyramids, and they are going to form the corticospinal tract. And these are the ones that go to the other side. So the decussation of the pyramids is located at this level. Here we see the accessory cranial nerve, because the motor nucleus of the accessory cranial nerve is located at this side, caudal to the nucleus ambiguous. Okay. So here we have the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve at here. And dorsally, we have the cunate and gracial fascicle. Okay, this is the Z nucleus. Here we have this fascicle, the cunate and gracial fascicle. So these fascicles are located here, involved with proprioception. And this structure in here, or this one, is going to become the ventral funiculus in the spinal cord and the lateral funiculus. So here we have the spinocerebellar tracts. Thank you very much.